this is a review of the book Espionage in Spain by Max Reiger. And you probably don't know what that is, and can't blame me for it, because this is a book that previously did not exist in English until very recently, because I translated it into English. And I assume there wasn't one before because we couldn't find this book anywhere. And you can see the cover in the bottom right of the screen now. Hopefully you can hear my voice as well. Forgive me, this is an early streaming attempt by me. I'm just going to make sure the audio works. But basically, we're going to be going into this book, which is very controversial. And I actually found a lot of the controversy and complexity really interesting. That this is not just what the book was published for. So essentially, this book was published by enemies of the author of the book. This book was published basically to say, this is an example of Stalinist fakery. This is an example of all the duplicity and evil that the communists, the Communist Party of Spain and the PSUC in Catalonia and their, allies in the Soviet Union, that they're duplicitous. And this is a big part of the whole narrative around the Spanish Revolution, the concept that Stalin betrayed the Spanish Revolution. So I'm not going to read the book to you, but I have it right here, and I'm going to show it to you right now. Pardon me, thank you. So here we can see the book. And hopefully there's no ownership problems with this, because it was published by communists almost 100 years ago. I shouldn't say that, less than 100 years ago. But it's been republished by people who, like I said, want to use it as an example to show that the communists actually didn't have the interest of the Spanish Revolution in mind, and all these kinds of things. But the other reason I wanted to talk about this book was because of another book that basically I thought showed all the problems of the communist movement with this stuff. So this is a book by MIT, not exactly a communist, unless you ask the author. So this was written in the 1960s, basically for the ears of the American military and their think tanks in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, at least the huge failures of the kind of counterinsurgency, anti-guerrilla strategy of the Americans. And so basically what this author, Barton Whaley, wanted to do was show how the Soviets actually innovated guerrilla warfare teachings and theory. And of course, this goes back to the not the Spanish Civil War, but the Russian Civil War, and the use of partisans, or the role of partisans and guerrillas in that conflict. And so basically, the author wants to draw lines that him and the American military apparatus can learn from of Soviet policy regarding this. So. But why did I say that this is an example of a communist view? Or why is this so relevant to all these false narratives by leftists that really led to this book, this other book, the Max Reiger book, being published in kind of a negative way? And so basically the reason is that this American imperialist advisor says that actually he's a leftist, and he's taking on this view of the struggle from a pro-leftist, pro-guerrilla point of view. He says, I'm so sympathetic to the position of the guerrilla, which liberals love to say. But he's to the left of Stalin and the communists in the struggle. So he takes on, and he says explicitly, I'm going to take on the position of George Orwell and Arthur Koestler. And these are two British intelligence agents, which we'll get into, who basically told this very exciting and interesting story about the Spanish Civil War to explain its results in a narratively engaging way that, of course, corresponds with kind of a left critique of the communists, which is not uncommon with bourgeois anti-communism. And that's how I would describe this book, Guerrillas of the Spanish Civil War, even though it talks about, you can kind of see here, the fact that the communists were the only ones doing the kind of responsible partisan guerrilla operations in the Spanish Civil War that the Republic refused to do. So the communists, Stalin, and the anarchists are in complete agreement on this issue that this book is about, the use of guerrillas in the Spanish Civil War. But he says basically that following Orwell, who is unreasonably now the default narrative, his book Homage to Catalonia, or we could say The Disgrace to Catalonia, that book is, which is now like the default history of the Spanish Civil War, which we should also call the Spanish Revolution, because this is one of the most important revolutionary situations in Europe, and the fate of Spain really defines the fate of Europe. So understanding this conflict, it's really not acceptable for us to be repeating these bourgeois memes over and over and over, which is what basically this book, even in 1969, does, and this new printing of Espionage in Spain also engages in this kind of typical anti-communism. And yet they don't really realize what they've done when they publish this, which is to give really interesting information about the reality. So what basically this publisher did, and there's this preface to the preface, this introduction before the original preface by the communist Jose Bergamin, which was basically like everything in the following, everything that you hear coming out of this book is a lie. It was all fabricated by Orlov, and this, really touches on a very exciting trend in, at least exciting for the bourgeoisie, trend in Soviet historiography, focused on the works that were published after this conflict, after Spain, by Orlov, who had fallen out with Stalin and the Soviet Union, and Krivitsky. So these authors, these bourgeois Western authors, there's such a limited supply of information about this conflict and about basically Soviet policy regarding these conflicts, especially going back to that MIT guy. He wants to know what the Soviets are going to do in Vietnam, in Laos. What are the Soviets going to advise the Laotian and Cambodian and Vietnamese guerrillas? What kind of tactics are the Soviet advisors going to tell these groups to use? And similarly, what advice would the Soviets give to Nicaraguans or El Salvadorians, etc., right? They want to use this information, this MIT guy, right, Barton Whaley, to basically fight American counterinsurgency. So, again, it's very interesting that this guy who loves Orwell and claims to be left-wing is doing this sort of work. But focusing on the book again, sorry, basically, I read that introduction that basically said, oh, everything that you're gonna read in here is a lie. We're only publishing it to expose Stalinist duplicity, right? That actually the communists were always hostile to the POUM. The communists were always hostile to the Trotskyists, and there was never really an attempt by the communists to work with everybody in a constructive way. They were holding everything back. That's something the MIT author also mentions, that the communists, they're actually regressive in the revolution. But when I read this introduction, I found that I really agreed with it, and I saw some interesting information in the following book. And basically, Jose Bergamin starts out by talking about, the Spaniard who left for Spain, reading a quote now, for Europe after July 18th, 1936, after the pronunciamento, I believe it's called, the uh, declaration by the military rebels that they weren't going to obey the Second Republic, and they were going to form the Francoist, clericalist with the Catholic Church dictatorship. But when Spaniards left Spain, they didn't hear condemnation of this horrible occurrence, right? This horrible fascist treason that occurred. What they heard was a bunch of lies and crap. And essentially that the communists were responsible, and the communists and anarchists were responsible for their own destruction, that they were brutal and they murdered Catholics, and this is particularly aimed at the anarchist burning of churches and the killing of Catholic priests who were collaborators with the Francoists. So instead of any kind of sympathy with the Spanish Republic, the people of Europe at this time, all they were talking about was the meme that the Spanish Republic was evil, there was Red Terror, killing priests, and all this thing. So they didn't really care about the reality that this Francoist dictatorship was emerging, and it was actually a puppet of Germany and Italy. And the governments of France and Britain and America, they didn't really want to embrace the truth that they had let down this democratic project, this collaboration between communists and anarchists and liberals to create the Second Spanish Republic. And the reason I felt so engaged and attached to this, and I'm sorry my slow demeanor on this is a new streaming format for me. Going into the book itself, it goes straight into the stakes that we're playing at, right? That this is a collaborative government in which anarchists, communists, and liberals, and even Catalan nationalists are, right-wing nationalists, are united against fascist terror. Pretty big stakes. So betraying the Popular Front, has huge implications for Europe and the world, basically. But this, of course, is aimed at audiences that are going to be caring about the big war in Europe that Germany and Italy are preparing for and launching at this time. Because this was written before World War II, I believe. Because they referred to, and I actually couldn't find much information about the original publication of this book. I only have limited amounts. And basically, what this book does is it goes into the details of what we would call the Trotskyist conspiracy. And so we have to take a direct approach to see, is there a Trotskyist conspiracy real, or is it a Stalinist conspiracy? And that's what really we have to break down, because that's what's presented for us straight on. And I think one thing this book does is that it really shows how there really is a lot to talk about when it comes to there being a Trotskyist conspiracy, whereas the introduction of this book originally, this Max Reiger Espionage in Spain book, it goes on and on to lay out on somewhat spurious grounds why we shouldn't trust the contents of the book. That it was this Max Reiger character doesn't really exist. I don't know why this is cut off. Oh, God damn. This background image is screwed up, but... crazy. All right. That's good enough. So one thing let's go over the evidence, and we can talk about why the authors questioned it. So the first thing they want to go into is the map. And it's a classic espionage story of this map of Madrid that had been drawn up in micrometer. I forget what it's actually called, but On the reverse of this map, which was actually found in a bust-up of a real fascist espionage clique, I believe in Madrid. And actually, maybe I can look and read this book again and find out that specific information. But on the back of this real piece of espionage work was written a letter by the head of the espionage organization, this pro-Franco espionage organization inside Spain, inside Republican Spain. And this invisible ink writing was written in a previously cracked cipher that the Republic had recently cracked of the Francoist code, and it said basically directly incriminating the POUM. So it was this kind of nail in the coffin to a lot of this other evidence that was actually also attached, but this was the crowning piece of evidence that you had this letter that was actually from, or actually attached to a real Francoist espionage organization, and it has the words, POUM in it, and it says that the POUM, this Trotskyist organization, this para-Trotskyist, we could say, accusing them, or rather incriminating them in the work of that Francoist espionage group, saying that POUM agents were working for Franco. So, of course, everyone has to say that this was completely fake, and there's legitimate reason to doubt it, especially when we know the other very famous book, probably the one that you guys would be most familiar with of any book about this subject, which would be the George Soria book about the same topic, about Trotskyism in the service of Franco, I believe is the title of the book. And the problem with the connection between that book and this one, that article in this one, is that they both talk about the same map, the same piece of evidence, that you've got this map, on the back of it is this evidence incriminating the POUM. And what we see is that George Soria later on retracted his belief in the book. And he actually didn't say that that any part of it was particularly fake, but he did kind of accuse it of being based on fraudulent evidence, indirectly. So that kind of goes on to be a rallying call for the authors who published this book originally, the kind of anti-communist authors, bourgeois academics. They seize upon what George Soria has said and what they now believe they know about the kind of disinformation apparatus of the Soviets and Orlov from Orlov's book and Kravitsky's book, leaping on these sources and really gripping them and making the best use of them as they possibly could. They're trying to milk them, essentially, for details to talk about the Stalinist betrayal. And what they do when they talk about this book is essentially to completely ignore the realities of what is being accused. And that's what we're here to talk about today, is there any truth to the idea that the POUM worked against the Second Republic, worked for Franco and Hitler? Big stakes. And of course, Trotskyists, as I've said, have distanced themselves from this by saying that the POUM split from the Fourth International, although now we know that Andrei Zanin had lots of correspondence with Trotsky in the previous years, I believe going back to 1932, during this period when Trotsky is forming these coalitions with his former enemies that we now know are real and were previously called Stalinist forgeries. So we've got the Trotsky alliance with groups inside the Soviet Union who he had a falling out with. Even as late as 1928, he's contacting these people and saying, oh, we should work together as a united opposition. And so this united opposition existed very briefly, but we can see that Andrei Zanin was corresponding very closely. He was a very close informant and ally of Trotsky during that period, 1939, or 1932. But this is of course, from much later. So they say, oh, he has no connection to the Fourth International. Andrei Nin and the POUM, no connection to Trotsky, and yet they defend it and they take up this cause as if it's their own, and they do use it to try to say that the Stalinists are evil. So they can't resist, even though they want to maintain their distance from this group because this group has positions that they don't support. They still want to use it, for their anti-Stalin purposes. So of course they say everything in this book and everything in the Stalinist accusations are completely fake. But once we get into the book, we start seeing that there's actually a lot more to it than the stuff that has been called fake. So the evidence that we have for the POUM engaging in this stuff is actually more than what has been called fake. So that leaves open a lot of possibilities to look into to understand what reality there is. And actually, in order to talk about how the communists act in regards to this, in regards to why didn't they just rely on the legal apparatus of the Spanish Second Republic to deal with this problem on its own. And I can go into that. But when we're starting out, we see agents from Madrid had been working to uncover a major espionage network with significant ramifications in Barcelona. So here we have direct connections to Barcelona with these accusations, going back to Madrid. The principal suspects were found in the leadership of the POUM. So that's a direct translation I made. Andrei Nin and other well-known individuals arrested. Now, this is a big bit of controversy about the events. Now, the source, but the events. And of course, the source disagrees with the current bourgeois interpretation of the events. The investigation brigade, led by Gomez Serrano, so the Spanish state, seized everything in the Falcon Hotel, which is where the POUM had their base of operations, and I believe George Orwell went there. And essentially, the Republican police arrest all the POUM leaders in a normal legal operation, but then someone dressed as police, and some people say that it was a far-right group, and some people said that it was a communist group, broke into the police station and actually fought the police and captured Andrei Nin and spirited him out of the police station. And so the Stalin side basically said that he had been escaped by fascist agents. And one interesting detail that they connect to talk about the idea that it could have been Andrei Nin's supposed fascist connections is that in 1921, Andrei Nin was arrested by German authorities, and unlike his compatriots, who were also arrested at that time, who were all sentenced to jail, Andrei Nin was the only one who was released without any kind of sentence. So there is conjecture by the book that he had been a fascist or German agent going back a long time. And actually this is not as crazy as it might sound to people who are new to this subject, but there were a lot of connections between, especially the Trotskyists, to the German intelligence. And the German intelligence were very active in political stuff like this. And so basically, one thing that is accused of the communists is that they tried to go outside the legal order of the Spanish Republic, and they kidnapped this guy. And one of the arguments that could be made that they did that was that the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, who were the helping out with spying on behalf of the Republic against the fascists, and of course, the Soviets were the biggest ally in terms of material contribution to the Spanish Republic. But as I said earlier, the only ones who took it seriously, besides anarchists, the task to engage in partisan warfare, engage in guerrilla warfare, where the lines were thin and weak on the Francoist front, because the Francoists believed in concentrating their forces into bases and not establishing a long, drawn out front line of trenches, that there was a possibility to penetrate. And so the NKVD established these organizations, these secret organizations with peasants and workers to secretly spy on Franco, to commit acts of sabotage against Franco. And you would have very highly trained NKVD agents, actually Russian individuals and other individuals directly in the employment of the Soviet Union, who would carry out these very sensitive tasks of like blowing up bridges and blowing up ammunition dumps, and making contacts with peasant organizations within Francoist territory and things like this. So you had very professional work being done by the NKVD. And the problem with talking about their reaction to Trotskyist betrayal back then versus what we know now is that the communists back then couldn't admit either to the Republic or to their Francoist enemies the extent of their guerrilla capabilities. They could not admit to either the Republic or to the Francoists that they had these broad networks of people infiltrating the Francoist line, basically independent military units carrying out missions that the Republic, companies, and the later leaders of the Republic basically refused to do. So the communists couldn't admit, hey, we have this extensive intelligence network that is operating all across the front line, that is penetrating the Francoists, and it will only be later on that these forces would be centralized under the Spanish state. This would be in 1937. So this is a very revolutionary situation where it's very unstable. Each political group has their own armed forces, and that includes the communists. And the POUM have their own very robust forces. And I think that's another thing that people don't talk about, are the really extensive networks and forces that the POUM had, because they want to talk about the POUM as pure victims who never had any capability to defend themselves against, the power of Stalin and this apparatus that the NKVD had set up for the Spanish Republic. But I'm gonna go down to the part of the book where they talk about the actual capabilities of the POUM. Let's see, armored cars and tanks and bombs. Sorry for inserting some nationalism into this stream, but this is a Popular Front stream, so. And yes, we are defending the Popular Front right now because the Trotskyist criticism is ridiculous and is in fact core to their treachery regarding this, that they used their objections to the Popular Front, their theoretical objections, which could be, found against the Popular Front, and basically use that to constantly campaign against the Spanish Republican government. And we have a quote from 1971 of the POUM leader saying that André Nin and the POUM leadership, this was Joaquin Morin, said that the POUM leadership, including Nin, did not care about winning the war, that their objective was not winning this war against fascism. And so, because they didn't care about winning, they supported policies that actually sabotaged the chances for the Second Republic to defeat Franco. And that's a very serious situation. So the POUM, all right, so here we read about the capabilities of the POUM. Just a brief aside, essentially. So we have from that questionably provenanced document, the report found that Roca's home informs Franco's intelligence services in Perpignan, which is a name you should recall. You should keep that in mind. That an uprising is being prepared with great activity. Most of the active members of the POUM will take part in it. So we have a lot of information showing that the POUM actually did support a uprising and were preparing for it. To this end, the preparation of a fifth column inside the Republic, the POUM had to procure weapons. It did so in many ways, legally, as if they were destined for the front, and illegally, by looting the weapon depots where its members worked. In addition, the POUM purchased weapons abroad with money that had been arbitrarily confiscated. And this is a criticism that's being made of the POUM otherwise, that they used their forces to carry out, arbitrary expropriations based on their own needs rather than centralized appropriations and expropriations on behalf of the Spanish state. And they had their own network on the border between Spain and France. So let's look at that border. Because this is being invoked as a central aspect of this whole thing. Let's see. I'm Googling a map to show you guys. And we have references to an organization in Bayonne, France, that are aimed at infiltrating Spain. We have sources about Perpignan. Maybe I'm reading that. Maybe I'm saying that incorrectly. Gosh, it's so hard to find a... Okay. Okay, let's check this out, this map. So we've got a mention of this organization in Perpignan. And that comes up in another article that I really wanted us to talk about, this one. Showing up very smallly, on Politsterm. And this article also references Perpignan. So I'm going to share this map. Here we go. To show the relationship between Barcelona and a possible Trotskyist apparatus in Perpignan. Here you see the Gulf of Lion, as it's written, or I suppose Lyon, if you read it properly. And you see there's a straight line over the Pyrenees Mountains, right? This border between Spain and France, see this yellow border. It's very mountainous, very sparsely populated, and there is a lot of smuggling operations. Mainly pro-Republic ones that are constantly sending weapons and equipment from France, supporters throughout the world, transporting it into France and smuggling it over the border into the territory of the Republic here in Catalonia. And so we have many leftist groups are engaging in this, including the POUM, right? They're smuggling over this border for their own purposes. And one thing that's interesting is that we've got some possible corruption and things like this going on with the POUM apparatus. We see in the historical record. So I'm going to go into this other article, right? And we're going to talk about a guy who started the May Days, or at least indirectly. And then we're going to talk about the result of the May Days and why we are talking about them so much. Sorry, I'm not looking at the chat either. Okay. So I'm reading from this article here, the Betrayers of the Spanish Revolution article, which surprisingly, despite coming from completely different sources from the Max Reiger book, right? This book, this one, coming from sources other than that one. It talks about the same points, the same essential points, and that was one of the big things I wanted to talk about here. So, I'm reading that article now, talking about the preview, the necessary prehistory that brought about the May Days, brought them into existence. Right, this rising tension between mainly the Friends of Durruti anarchists in Catalonia and the POUMists and other Catalan nationalists that are leading the Barcelona May Days, or at least inciting them. In November of 1936, the article quotes, "The Catalan government, with the full support of the anarchist CNT, suppressed a smaller nationalist revolt in the area of Belver. After doing so, they were made better aware, of the full activities that were going on in the Sardinia region, which is around here where the map shows, east of Aragon." Sorry, I'm putting this in a satisfying area of the screen. To control in the Sardinia region, which shared its border with France. To control the flow of materials to and from capitalist France, a police patrol of carabiniers, right, carabinieri in Italy, was stationed in the towns. Of police security force of the Republic was stationed in this town of near Puigcerdà. So the presence of the police threatened to uncover the lucrative smuggling activities of the forces based in neighboring Puigcerdà, which brought arms to the local elements of the FAI from France. Not for the arming of the military forces of the front against Franco, but for the partisan strengthening of their own forces. Their armed strength, and that's the same accusation that the book makes, that they were arming, the POUMists were arming themselves and not applying that armament to the front lines, which were supposed to be manned by them. And in fact, we see the controversy, this historical controversy, it's not a Stalinist accusation, that the POUM oversaw a cold front, or a silent front, in which there is a front line with the enemy, and in fact, they were not hostile with each other, and in fact, were kind of friendly, right? Like the football game, soccer game between German and French forces in World War I. There's a lot of this in every war, right? Vietnam, World War I. There's silent fronts in which there's fraternization, kind of friendly relations between the opposing forces. And there's a big accusation, big problem being that's pointed out with the POUM presence on the front, is that they fostered such a quiet front, right? They weren't actively hostile to the Francoist forces. And one thing that the book, Espionage in Spain, mentions is that the POUM actually didn't reject these advances by the Francoist forces. They didn't ban their soldiers from talking to the Francoists, even though the Francoists were actively trying to convert people on the front lines to cross over and abandon the struggle. Quoting again, "Their armed strength increased their capacity to enact their program, which involved the systemic extortion of deserters and robbery to enrich themselves. Indeed, criminal activity such as passport falsification was covertly centered in Puigcerdà. The leader of this ring was the mayor of Puigcerdà." And I'm sorry that I can't pull it up for you guys, this pronunciation of
Puigcerdà. Puigcerdà.
No. I was hoping it would read it out for us. No? Try one more time.
Puigcerdà.
No. The mayor of this town, Antonio Martín Escudero, a middleman between the FAI-affiliated unions and the bosses, who supported collectivization, this mayor did, of livestock, only to control the cattle for his private use. So the mayor was making private use of this cattle that had been expropriated from the local bourgeois. And in fact, he was a negotiator with the bosses while he was in charge of this livestock that had been collectivized, and who exercised a hated tax on the smaller towns of La Cerdania, which is the Spanish writing of La of this region Cerdania, that I'm butchering the Catalan. The anarchist system of rule in that region, which was such a focus for the private forces of organized crime, French bourgeois interests, and the Francoist infiltration forces based across the border in the city of Perpignan, had enabled the rise of new exploitative relations to emerge. Suddenly, this strong man, Antonio, in coordination with the POUM militiamen garrisoned nearby, assaulted the makeshift barracks of the Republican patrol, right? Those carabineers, policemen, who are now monitoring the border. So the POUM and this corrupt mayor, Antonio Martin Escudero, attacked the border police and took the men hostage on the 1st of March, 1937. So this is months before the May Days revolt. No legitimate reason is given for the attack, only the concerns of the ruling Puigcerda Committee, who threatened to execute these Republican soldiers unless the CNT and the government met to arrange their terms. Instead, the mayor and some of his men were killed by armed forces of the anarchist CNT in the fighting for control of the border post. So this isn't even a anarchist versus overreaching state and Stalinist state, which is the myth and the meme that we hear over and over again, that the Spanish Republic was completely run by the Stalinists. Instead, we see that the anarchists are fighting the corrupt anarchists. The more responsible forces of the anarchist CNT are fighting we could call them traitors, the accused traitors. Thus, it was anarchists in government, and recall that the anarchists had recently joined the Republican government in a huge coup, metaphorical coup. That this is actually a very good thing that happened, that the CNT and the FEI supported the Spanish Republic's fight against fascism. So it wasn't a anarchist thing. And in fact, the Friends of Durruti, the anarchist contingent that fought on the May Days, calls the CNT and the FAI traitor anarchists, right? That they betrayed true anarchism in support of this anti-fascist republic. Thus, it was anarchists in government who carried the necessary duty of shedding the blood of counter-revolutionaries who hide under a political banner in a peripheral skirmish, which would later be tied to the explosions of tensions characterized by the coming May Days. These events are given passing mention by Orwell, who sought to create the mythology which today persists, including underpinning every turn of the conflict on the communists and painting the strongman of Puigcerda as a well-known anarchist, euphemistically murdered in a conspiracy against the workers. And these narratives are clung to by contemporary anarchists, despite the anarchists of that time holding completely opposite positions. As well as presaging them, these battles in the Cerdania typify the general nature of the more serious May Days. But yeah, basically, it's very interesting that the POUM want to control the border region where they do this smuggling to Perpignan. And if we look at the book, we find that Perpignan is also the focus of espionage. Let's put this back on top. No? Oh, pardon me. We continue. We reproduce, and pardon for my previous silence there, I muted myself, a photocopy of a letter found during a search of the home of Andrade, a member of the POUM Central Committee. All right, this letter talks about the illegal purchases of weapons that they did use to abandon the front line and retreat to Barcelona. So I'm getting kind of tired. I might actually end this early. Let's see. Where? Oh, there we are.